There is a kind of power that reveals itself only in absence. Not in what you say, but in what you withhold. Not in how close you stand, but in how far you're willing to step back. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago, yet we live in a world that has forgotten it entirely. We chase connection like addicts, believing that proximity equals influence, that availability equals importance. But what if the opposite were true? What if the moment you create distance is the moment you gain control? Consider this. Every text you send seeking reassurance, every explanation you offer when none was asked for, every time you make yourself too available to someone who barely thinks of you, these aren't acts of connection. They're surrenders of power, and somewhere deep inside, you know it. You feel it in the exhaustion that comes from chasing, in the quiet resentment that builds when you're taken for granted, in the slow erosion of your own self-respect. This isn't about being cold. It's about understanding a law that operates beneath the surface of all human interaction. That value is created not through abundance, but through scarcity. We live in an age of compulsive closeness. Social media has collapsed the natural distance between people, turning every moment into a performance, every silence into an emergency. We document our lives in real time, respond to messages within seconds, make ourselves endlessly available because we've been taught that connection is the highest virtue. But Machiavelli would have seen through this immediately. He understood that people don't respect what they can always access. They don't value what freely gives itself away. The leader who is always present becomes background noise. The person who always responds loses mystery. The one who never says no becomes invisible. This is where our story begins, in the tension between what we've been taught and what actually works. Between the modern obsession with transparency and the ancient wisdom of strategic withdrawal. Machiavelli wrote The Prince not as a manual for cruelty, but as a field guide to human nature stripped of sentiment. And one of his most profound insights was this: distance is not the absence of power, it is the condition for power. When you step back, you force others to lean forward. When you withdraw your attention, you make it valuable. When you stop explaining yourself, you become impossible to diminish. But to understand why this works, we need to go deeper. We need to examine not just the mechanics of power, but the psychology beneath it. Why do we fear distance? Why does withdrawal feel like abandonment? And why do we mistake constant availability for love, when so often it breeds only contempt? The answer lies in something Machiavelli knew well, that most people live their entire lives governed by the opinions of others. They shape themselves around external validation, measuring their worth by how much they're needed, how quickly they respond, how available they make themselves. And in doing so, they hand their power to anyone willing to take it. Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to gain acceptance from the world. We learn early that being pleasant, being available, being agreeable keeps us safe. We modify ourselves to fit into the expectations of family, friends, lovers, employers. And slowly, without realizing it, we become strangers to our own desires. We say yes when we mean no. We stay when we want to leave. We offer explanations for choices that need no justification. And with each concession, each over-explanation, each moment of excessive availability, we train others to disrespect us. Machiavelli saw this pattern play out in the courts of Renaissance Italy. He watched princes who gave too much, too easily, lose everything. He observed rulers who showered their subjects with gifts and attention, only to be overthrown by those same people the moment difficulty arose. And he drew a conclusion that still makes people uncomfortable. Generosity without boundaries is not virtue, it's weakness. Availability without limits is not kindness, it's self-destruction. To be powerful, you must first be separate. To be valued, you must first be scarce. This isn't manipulation, it's physics. The same way scarcity creates economic value, distance creates relational power. When you're always available, you become taken for granted. When you always initiate, you teach others they never have to. When you explain every decision, you invite others to judge and approve them. You give away the authority over your own life, piece by piece, until you wake up one day wondering why no one respects you, why your efforts go unappreciated, why you feel invisible despite doing everything for everyone. The modern world sells us a lie, that we must always be present, always responsive, always open. That boundaries are selfish, that distance is cold, that withholding is manipulation. But Machiavelli would have recognized this for what it is, a control mechanism. A way to keep people compliant, eager to please, perpetually seeking approval. Because someone who understands the power of distance can't be controlled. Someone who knows when to withdraw can't be manipulated. Someone who values their own attention can't be taken for granted. And this is where the real work begins. Not in learning tricks or techniques, but in confronting the deeper truth, that our fear of distance comes from a fear of being alone with ourselves. We chase connection because silence terrifies us. We make ourselves available because we're afraid of what it means if we're not needed. We explain ourselves endlessly because we haven't yet learned that our choices need no justification beyond our choosing them. The person who can't be alone with themselves will always be at the mercy of others. The person who fears losing connection will always sacrifice power to maintain it. Machiavelli's law of distance isn't about becoming cold or withholding love. It's about understanding that true connection can only exist between equals, and equality requires boundaries. It's about recognizing that your presence is a gift, not an obligation. That your time and attention are resources to be invested wisely, not scattered carelessly. That the people who truly value you will respect your absence, while those who don't will reveal themselves through their resentment of it. So what happens when you start to pull back? When you stop responding immediately, stop explaining your choices, stop making yourself endlessly available? At first, there's panic. Not just from others, but from within yourself. Because distance triggers something primal in us. The fear of abandonment, the terror of being forgotten, the anxiety that if we're not constantly present, we'll cease to matter. This is the shadow speaking. The part of you that learned early that love is conditional, that acceptance must be earned through service, that your value lies in what you provide to others. Jung understood this mechanism perfectly. He saw that we construct our identities around what earns us acceptance, and in doing so, we exile parts of ourselves into the unconscious. The parts that want to say no, the parts that need solitude, the parts that refuse to explain or justify. These become shadow material, aspects of self we've deemed unacceptable, dangerous, selfish. And so we overcompensate. We become the person who's always there, always helping, always available. Not because it's who we are, but because it's who we think we must be to deserve love. But here's what Machiavelli knew and Jung would have agreed with. The shadow always takes its revenge. The parts of you that you deny don't disappear, they express themselves sideways. In resentment toward the people you're constantly available for. In exhaustion that turns into bitterness. In moments when you snap unexpectedly, or withdraw completely, or sabotage relationships because some part of you knows you've been giving too much for too long. The person who can't create healthy distance doesn't become more loving, they become a martyr. And martyrs, as Machiavelli observed, are admired in theory but discarded in practice. Think about the relationships in your life where you feel most powerless. Where you're always the one reaching out, always the one accommodating, always the one adjusting your schedule and your needs to fit someone else's convenience. Now ask yourself honestly, does that person respect you? Do they treat your time as valuable? Do they appreciate your availability, or have they simply come to expect it? The uncomfortable truth is that constant availability doesn't create gratitude, it creates entitlement. People don't value what costs them nothing. This is where most people get stuck. They recognize the pattern, but they can't break it because they're afraid. Afraid that if they pull back, they'll be abandoned. Afraid that if they stop initiating, no one will reach out. Afraid that their worth is genuinely tied to their usefulness. And this fear isn't irrational, it's based on experience. Because the truth is, when you start creating distance, some people will disappear. Some relationships will end. Some people will be offended by your boundaries and will choose to walk away rather than respect them. And this is where Machiavelli's wisdom becomes genuinely difficult to implement. Because it requires accepting loss. It requires being willing to let go of connections that only existed because you were willing to diminish yourself to maintain them. Machiavelli wrote that it's better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. But the deeper truth is this. It's better to be alone than to be surrounded by people who only value your presence when it serves them. Nietzsche called this the herd mentality, the way most people seek comfort in belonging, even when that belonging requires constant self-sacrifice. The herd doesn't want you to be powerful. It wants you to be predictable, manageable, available. It wants you to play your role in the social machinery without questioning whether that role serves you. And the moment you start creating distance, the moment you stop being so available, the herd responds with judgment. You're being distant, you're being cold, you're changing, you're not who you used to be. And they're right, you're not who you used to be. You're becoming who you actually are beneath the performance of constant availability. You're discovering that your worth isn't measured by how quickly you respond to messages or how much you sacrifice for others. You're learning that respect comes not from giving everything, but from knowing what to withhold. And this transformation is threatening to people who benefited from your lack of boundaries. This is the descent, the dark night where you confront how much of yourself you've been giving away. How many relationships are built on your willingness to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating than you naturally are? How much of your life energy has been spent managing other people's emotions, explaining your choices, proving your worth, seeking permission to exist as you are? And in that confrontation, there's grief. Real, heavy grief for all the years spent living outside yourself. For all the moments you said yes when every cell in your body screamed no. But there's also something else. Something Machiavelli understood when he wrote about power, and Jung understood when he wrote about individuation, and Nietzsche understood when he wrote about self-overcoming. That grief, that confrontation with how much you've given away, it's not the end. It's the beginning. Because the moment you see clearly how you've been living, you gain the power to choose differently. The moment you recognize the pattern, you can break it. Distance becomes power when it's conscious, when it's not reactive withdrawal or punishment, but strategic choice. When you pull back not to hurt others or to play games, but to protect your energy and reclaim your autonomy. When you stop explaining not because you're arrogant, but because you recognize that your choices need no justification beyond your making them. When you become less available not to prove a point, but because you finally learned that your time and attention are the most valuable resources you have. This is where the law of distance transforms from tactic to truth. It stops being about manipulating others and becomes about respecting yourself. Because when you create distance, you create space. Space to hear your own thoughts, to feel your own feelings, to discover what you actually want beneath all the conditioning that taught you to want what others want from you. And in that space, something remarkable happens. You become interesting again, not because you're performing or strategizing, but because you're finally present to your own life instead of scattered across everyone else's. Machiavelli's actual law can be stated simply. Those who are too present lose their power, while those who maintain distance increase it. But like all profound truths, its simplicity conceals layers of complexity. Because distance doesn't mean absence. It doesn't mean coldness or cruelty or indifference. It means selectivity. It means understanding that your attention is currency, and like any currency, it loses value when printed without limit. In The Prince, Machiavelli observed that rulers who gave too freely, who showered subjects with gifts and presents and accessibility, were ultimately overthrown or dismissed. Meanwhile, rulers who maintained a certain remoteness, who were seen occasionally rather than constantly, who kept some part of themselves unavailable, these rulers commanded lasting respect and loyalty. Not because they were crueler, but because they understood a psychological principle that remains true 5 centuries later. Human beings assign value based on scarcity, not abundance. This isn't cynicism, it's observation. Watch how people treat what's always available to them versus what they must work to access. Notice the difference between how someone values a friendship where they're always pursued versus one where both people make effort. Pay attention to how respect shifts in relationships where one person is always accommodating and one person expects to be accommodated. The patterns are consistent across contexts because they're rooted in fundamental human psychology. The application of this law extends far beyond romantic relationships or friendships. It operates in professional settings, where the colleague who's always in the office, always saying yes to requests, always available is often the one passed over for promotion. It operates in negotiations, where the party willing to walk away has more power than the party desperate to close. It operates in creative work, where artists who are mysterious and selective about their public presence often command more fascination than those who document every moment. But here's where most people misapply Machiavelli's wisdom. They think it's about playing hard to get, about creating artificial scarcity, about manipulating others through calculated unavailability. And that misses the point entirely. Because distance as manipulation is still operating from the same place as constant availability, from fear, from insecurity, from the belief that your worth must be managed and performed rather than simply lived. Real power through distance comes from something deeper. It comes from genuinely valuing your own time and attention enough that you're selective about where you invest them. It comes from developing a life rich enough that you don't need any single person or relationship to feel complete. It comes from building such a strong center of self that your sense of worth doesn't depend on whether others approve of your choices or miss you when you're gone. The Roman Stoics understood this. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor with ultimate power, wrote constantly about the importance of inner distance, of not being moved by praise or criticism, of maintaining equanimity regardless of external circumstances. He knew that real power wasn't in commanding others, but in commanding himself. In not needing the approval of his subjects, the validation of his peers, the constant presence of confidants. His power came from his ability to be alone with himself without anxiety, to make decisions based on principle rather than popularity, to remain unmoved by the shifting opinions of those around him. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy intersects with Machiavelli's strategy. Nietzsche spoke of the will to power, but he didn't mean power over others. He meant power over oneself. The ability to direct your own life, to live according to your values rather than the values imposed by the herd, to create meaning from your own center rather than borrowing it from others. And this requires distance, not just physical or temporal distance, but psychological distance, the ability to observe your own impulses toward people-pleasing, toward over-explaining, toward making yourself small to fit into others' expectations, and to choose differently. When you create this kind of distance, something shifts in how others perceive you. You become harder to categorize, harder to control, harder to take for granted. Not because you're playing games, but because you're genuinely living from your own center. You stop explaining your choices because you no longer need external validation for them. You stop being always available because you have a life that matters to you independent of any relationship. You stop chasing connection because you're no longer afraid of solitude. And paradoxically, this is when genuine connection becomes possible. Because relationships between two people who don't need each other are fundamentally different from relationships between people who are desperate for each other. When you don't need someone's approval to feel okay about yourself, you can actually see them clearly rather than seeing them through the distortion of your need. When you're not afraid of losing someone, you can be honest with them. When you don't require constant reassurance, you can give others space to show up voluntarily rather than out of obligation. Machiavelli wrote The Prince as a guide to maintaining power in a world of competing interests and shifting alliances. But the deepest application of his wisdom isn't in Renaissance politics. It's in the daily choices you make about how you show up in your own life. Do you make yourself small to fit into someone else's expectations? Do you over-explain your choices to people who haven't earned the right to question them? Do you chase relationships where you're clearly not valued? Do you give your time and energy freely to people who treat them carelessly? These aren't abstract questions. They're the building blocks of either a life of quiet desperation or a life of genuine power. And power here doesn't mean dominance, it means self-possession. It means owning your choices completely. It means understanding that your life is yours to direct, not something to be negotiated with everyone who has an opinion about it. It means recognizing that every moment you spend managing someone else's feelings about your boundaries is a moment stolen from actually living. The ethical question that always arises here is whether this is selfish. Whether creating distance, maintaining boundaries, being selective with your availability is somehow cold or uncaring. And Machiavelli would answer that the question itself reveals confusion about what care actually means. Because taking care of yourself isn't the opposite of caring for others, it's the prerequisite for it. You can't give genuinely from depletion. You can't connect authentically from desperation. You can't love others well if you don't respect yourself enough to maintain boundaries. The difference between healthy distance and manipulation is simple. Manipulation uses distance as a weapon to control others, while healthy distance uses boundaries as protection to maintain self. One is about making others chase you so you can feel powerful. The other is about respecting yourself enough to stop chasing people who don't value your presence. One is strategic calculation designed to create an effect. The other is natural consequence of genuinely having a life that matters to you. So where does this leave you, standing at the edge of your own transformation? You've seen the pattern now. You've recognized how much power you've given away through constant availability, through over-explaining, through making yourself small to fit into relationships that required your diminishment. And now comes the hardest part, actually changing. Actually implementing what Machiavelli knew, what Jung would call integrating your shadow, what Nietzsche described as becoming who you are. The first step is the most uncomfortable one. You have to stop. Stop responding immediately to every message. Stop explaining your choices to people who haven't earned the right to question them. Stop making yourself available to people who only reach out when they need something. Stop sacrificing your time and energy to maintain relationships where you're clearly not valued. And when you stop, there will be consequences. People will notice. Some will be offended. Some will accuse you of changing, of being distant, of not caring anymore. And they're not entirely wrong. You are changing. You're becoming someone who cares about yourself as much as you've always cared about others. You're becoming someone who understands that your worth isn't measured by how much you give away. You're becoming someone who knows that silence is often more powerful than explanation, that absence can communicate more than presence, that distance is sometimes the truest form of self-respect. This transformation requires you to sit with discomfort, to resist the urge to fill every silence, to soothe every tension, to immediately reassure anyone who seems upset by your boundaries. It requires you to tolerate other people's disappointment without rushing to fix it. To let relationships end if they only existed because you were willing to diminish yourself. To trust that the people who truly value you will respect your boundaries, while those who don't will reveal themselves through their resistance to them. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming fully yourself by integrating the parts you've split off and denied. The part of you that wants to say no, the part that needs solitude, the part that refuses to explain or justify. These aren't character flaws, they're necessary aspects of a complete self. But you've been taught to see them as selfish, as cold, as wrong. And so you've exiled them, tried to be only the accommodating, available, endlessly giving parts. And in doing so, you've become half a person, exhausted and resentful, giving from depletion rather than abundance. Reclaiming those exiled parts doesn't make you cruel. It makes you whole. It allows you to give genuinely when you choose to, rather than compulsively because you're afraid of what happens if you don't. It allows you to be present with people because you want to be, not because you're terrified of being alone. It allows you to maintain connections from choice rather than need. And that changes everything. Nietzsche wrote about the will to power as the fundamental drive toward self-overcoming, toward becoming more fully yourself. And he saw clearly that this requires you to separate from the herd, to stop living according to values that were never yours, to create your own meaning rather than borrowing it from others. This isn't easy. The herd doesn't release you willingly. It judges, it criticizes, it tries to shame you back into compliance. And inside yourself, the parts that learn to survive through accommodation will resist fiercely, will flood you with anxiety and guilt every time you set a boundary or choose yourself over someone else's expectations. But on the other side of that resistance is something Machiavelli understood deeply: genuine power. Not power over others, but power that comes from self-possession, from knowing who you are and living from that center regardless of who approves. The power that comes from valuing your own time and attention enough to be selective about where you invest them. The power that comes from not needing anyone's permission to exist as you are. And here's what's remarkable. When you start living this way, when you create genuine distance based on self-respect rather than strategy, people respond differently. Not everyone, some will leave, offended by your boundaries. But the ones who remain, the ones who respect your distance, who don't require your constant availability, who value your presence precisely because it's not given carelessly, those relationships deepen. They become real connections between equals rather than performances where one person constantly accommodates while the other constantly expects. You stop explaining not because you're arrogant, but because you've learned that people who trust you don't require explanations, and people who don't trust you won't believe them anyway. You become less available not to punish anyone, but because you've finally built a life rich enough that no single person or relationship can be your everything. You create distance not as manipulation, but as the natural consequence of respecting yourself enough to stop chasing people who don't reciprocate your effort. This is Machiavelli's law of distance in its fullest expression, not as a tactic for controlling others, but as a truth about what happens when you finally stop abandoning yourself for connection. When you recognize that your presence is a gift, not an obligation. When you understand that true connection can only exist between people who are complete in themselves, who don't need each other but choose each other. When you realize that every moment you spend over-explaining or over-giving or over-functioning in relationships is a moment you're teaching others that your boundaries don't matter. The practical application is simple but not easy. Next time someone questions your choices, notice your impulse to explain and justify. Then pause. Let silence do the work that words can't. Next time someone expects your immediate availability, notice your anxiety about disappointing them. Then choose your own priorities anyway. Next time you feel yourself shrinking to fit into someone else's expectations, notice the discomfort. Then take up the space you actually need. Each time you do this, you're not being cruel, you're being clear. You're communicating through action what words never could. That your time matters, your energy matters, your choices matter. That you're no longer available for relationships that require your constant diminishment. That distance isn't punishment, it's self-respect. And gradually, as you practice this, something shifts. The anxiety lessens, the guilt fades, and in its place grows something solid and unmovable, a sense of self that doesn't depend on anyone's approval, doesn't require anyone's validation, doesn't need constant connection to know it exists. This is what Machiavelli saw in the princes who maintained power, not cruelty, but clarity. Not coldness, but boundaries. Not manipulation, but the simple understanding that value is created through scarcity, and that your presence becomes precious only when it's not given carelessly. This is what Jung meant by integrating the shadow, not becoming cruel, but becoming whole. Not denying your need for connection, but refusing to sacrifice yourself for it. This is what Nietzsche meant by self-overcoming, not dominating others, but mastering yourself. Not living according to their expectations, but creating your own values and standing by them. And this is where power and peace converge. Because the person who knows how to create distance, who understands when to withdraw, who can be alone without loneliness, that person can't be controlled. Can't be manipulated through fear of abandonment. Can't be diminished through others' judgments. They've found something the world can never give them and therefore can never take away. The ability to stand alone, complete in themselves, needing nothing from anyone except what's freely given. The world will always demand explanations. It will always expect your availability. It will always test your boundaries to see if they're real. But the wise understand something Machiavelli knew 5 centuries ago. Power doesn't explain. It doesn't chase. It doesn't prove itself. It simply is, and it reveals itself most clearly not in what you give, but in what you know how to withhold. If you're drawn to ideas like this, philosophical truths that cut through the noise of modern life and speak to something deeper, subscribe to this channel. We're exploring timeless wisdom from thinkers like Machiavelli, Jung, and Nietzsche, translating it for the battles you're actually fighting. Because the work of becoming yourself, of reclaiming power through distance, of living from your own center, that work never ends. But it's the only work that matters.